Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. A jam-packed day of action as the summer break comes to an end and the Dutch Grand Prix weekend gets underway. Ricciardo and Sergio Perez in the spotlight today. Ricciardo because of a potential injury he suffered in a crash we'll get into, but Perez because Helmut Marko has confirmed he is far from guaranteed to have next year's Red Bull seat. Seems that Red Bull are choosing right now between Ricciardo and Perez for next year's car, and they reckon that if Perez doesn't improve his qualifying, it's more likely than not going to be Mr. Ricciardo. Remember to read your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always. Here's Daniel and Yuki on a scooter in the paddock, and honestly, I thought he was going to get injured doing this, but he managed to do that elsewhere, we'll see. Now, Red Bull don't have, I think they've got a slight change to their beam wing this weekend, and they were trying some things out with the Flovis paint, but their next big upgrade, another one, is going to come in Singapore, and even Helmut Marko said the step they took in Hungary wasn't particularly big. Singapore is going to be even bigger, so maybe this weekend and the next couple of weekends, that's the chance, because if Red Bull take another big step in Singapore, I don't know who's going to be stopping them for the end of the season, especially because Mercedes are saying, well, you know, Brazil, Interlagos, there's always a chance to beat them there, but yeah, new upgrades for Red Bull still coming along. Now, the other side of Red Bull, though, is their car for next season. They can win the championship this year with just Max. If Perez didn't exist, if they had only one car on track, Max would still be winning the Constructors on his own as it stands. I mean, he's winning it right now, and there's only been maybe 15 times in F1 history where a driver has been able to win the championship, the Constructors on their own, and Verstappen's going to do that this year. Next year, it won't be so simple. Perez has even said in the last couple of days the car at the start of the year suited him quite nicely, and it fell away from him as the season progressed. Kind of saying, you know, they're developing for Verstappen and all this type of stuff. Those aren't really the words that Red Bull will necessarily want to hear, even if they are true, and you can't necessarily blame Red Bull for developing in the direction of their faster driver. But Helmut Marko was apparently seen in conversations with Perez's agent over the last couple of days, and those conversations were apparently not on extending his contract, as we hear, well, maybe from the agent side, but not from Red Bull's side. So, as Helmut Marko says, it's definitely not confirmed right now that Perez is going to be there in the Red Bull next year. Nothing is 100% certain. Somewhere there's always a performance-related situation to talk about. We'll take a look at it and discuss how to proceed in Zandvoort, then we will know more. Going on to say that Perez has to perform better, basically. This means he has to improve his qualifying. Everything else is clear for this year. As for next year, we'll see. So this sounds an awful lot like they might be heavily considering getting rid of Perez, because Helmut Marko's statements over the last couple of weeks have been more like, well, you know, Perez is locked in for next year, he's got a contract, it's all fine, and, you know, we're winning everything anyway, which is true, but if they think that Perez is a potential liability, and now Helmut Marko has very quickly changed his tune to all of a sudden be saying, actually, Perez, you've got to do much better very quickly, or you're not going to be in the car next year. Maybe they're just really impressed with Ricciardo and they want to put him in a seat, because Ricciardo has also said in recent days that he intends to end his career in the Red Bull family. And ideally that will be at some point or another back in a starting Red Bull seat. So as even Helmut Marko says, we're very happy with his performance. Now we're going to discuss the potential injury here in a second. He's at the hospital now for an X-ray. We have Ricciardo, we have Lawson. They also have De Vries as well, and we'll get into that in a second as a possibility. We want to do next year with Perez, but he needs to perform for that. So, you know, what are their expectations of Perez's performance? Do they? I think they probably just want him to be P2. If he can get P2 consistently in like a few of the next few races, let's say 3-4 of the next 5 races, he can get P2. They're probably happy enough with that. But if he doesn't, then, and also qualifying is another big point as well, that especially given how competitive qualifying is and how far Perez is right now off Verstappen's pace, you know, tomorrow's qualifying might not be pretty for Perez, as the numbers presently look. So we'll get into that now. So we'll talk FP1, FP2, some upgrades to Mercedes. I believe we saw some images from it, the change of the floor edge. I know people are like, oh, 3 seconds lap faster, right? At this point of the season, the changes are going to be generally slightly more marginal, but this should be a good circuit for Mercedes, theoretically. And Hamilton was on a pretty good lap during FP1 when Nico Hülkenberg binned it in the wall. We'll just look at the standings here quickly on the left-hand side. Perez was fastest at this time with both Williams behind him. Now, we don't really know what sort of fuel loads, what sort of engine modes the Williams were running, but it's not a circuit where you'd think they'd be that good, really, compared to, you'd think circuits with lots of straights, that's where they're going to be good. Not necessarily this more high downforce track, and it's only practice, but Williams were looking good today, as were in fairness Alpine. Hamilton then had to back off of this flare because Hülkenberg spun out at the final corner and ended up in the barriers. Just about, I think he did some damage to the front wing, and Günther Steiner said that that's a brand new front wing they've put on the car, so yeah, not ideal to damage that piece. Towards the end, Verstappen and many other drivers had a bit of an escapade through the gravel trap in just before the final set of corners, where all the grandstands are, you know where it is. So Verstappen had a bit of an off there, but he does end up topping the session regardless. Alonso P2, Aston were looking good with their new significant upgrade during FP1. Wasn't really there in FP2 so much, to be fair. Hamilton was then P3, arguably the top 3 drivers of the season, so no surprises. Now, this was the big incident with Ricciardo and Piastri. Piastri just straight up lost the car going round the banked corner, and then it seemed like Ricciardo didn't see Piastri had parked his car on, this is the racing line. You don't go low, you can go low, but the racing line is to go high on this corner, and if you try and take the racing line, you'd be smashing into Piastri. So Ricciardo didn't see this in time, and couldn't really take avoiding action other than to bid it in the wall himself. So Ricciardo slams it in the wall, does a load of damage to his front wing, and also holds on to the steering wheel as you go. And you'll see often drivers, when they are going to crash, they'll let go of the steering wheel, because as soon as the wheels hit the crash barrier, the wheel that you're holding in your hands will get yanked around with a lot of force and potentially can cause some pretty serious damage. Now we can see immediately after this crash, it wasn't anything crazy in terms of speed. I mean, it wasn't great. It wasn't like a head-on impact, and it was at a slight angle, and you can see how far the wheels are over to the right-hand side. Ricciardo then gets out the car. He's holding his kind of elbow here, like it's part of it, just down from his shoulder, and then in this one he's holding his wrist. So doesn't look great, you gotta say. Hopefully it's all okay for Ricciardo, but if he has done any damage there, there's a good chance he won't be racing for the rest of the weekend. They will have some potential replacements, of course, AlphaTauri to come in. Let's say Nick De Vries is an option apparently as well. He could come back in for Ricciardo, but if Ricciardo does race, it could provide a really good chance, because drivers that have some sort of injury in a racing are given a lot of benefit of the doubt, and for good reason. But if Ricciardo does race and does pretty well with potentially a bit of an injury, and Perez wasn't to, then it really does add fuel to the fire of the discussion that we're having. Ricciardo was then spotted in this car on the way to the hospital for an x-ray with, you can see this sling right around his kind of neck here, around his shoulder, and even from this angle shows it slightly better. So yeah, definitely, okay, they always take heavy precautions, right, and for good reason on stuff like this, but still, Ricciardo doesn't look especially happy, and yeah, he's got his arm in a sling, so whether it's a wrist thing, whether it's like a shoulder thing, I don't really know, maybe it's an elbow thing, tough to say, but it doesn't look perfect for Ricciardo as it stands, and as Chris Medland says, they might need either Liam Lawson is one option, or they could get Nick De Vries back, apparently, which would be very entertaining if that was to be the case. I don't think that will be the case, but yeah, Ricciardo's off to the local hospital for some checks here. And this was nice as well that AlphaTauri, the marshals, actually came up and gave a nice little present here to Daniel and said, hopefully your wrist is okay. And as Midland says here, lovely touch, he's off having x-rays right now. Now, I think that Albert Fabrega said that it's nothing serious, but I don't imagine that you really know until he turns up to the hospital and they actually check him out. So, if he is going to the hospital, it shows that there's at least some concern. I'm sure we'll get some announcements this evening as to whether Ricciardo will be good to continue for tomorrow, and I think on the balance of probabilities he probably will be. But if he isn't, that's a very big story. And it's especially not looking good, as I've just seen this from Helmut Marko, who says Daniel has severe pain in his wrist that he twisted. So, yeah, it's not looking good as it stands. Now, FP2, which was arguably a slightly more representative session, a bit more running in this one, and we had a lot of cars pushing it on the softer tyres for a bit longer. Lando Norris tops the session. McLaren weren't really anywhere in FP1, and obviously Piastri wasn't anywhere in FP2. But Norris put in a great lap, a 1:11.3. Verstappen was just behind. Now, Verstappen his first lap was not clean at all. It was about 0.3 down. He then improved on the same set of soft tyres to go marginally down on Norris. So there's still probably more to come for the Red Bull. there's always more to come from the Red Bull if it's not P1. It's just how it is. And qualifying isn't even the Red Bull's strength. But then Albon P3, and even, okay, Sargent was P12, but he wasn't far off the pace Sargent. He was very competitive. So the Williams is looking pretty tasty. Hamilton put in a nice lap as well, only 3/10 off Norris, but still, the Mercedes is looking okay. There's questions as to whether they're setting up more for the race than for qualifying, but if you do qualify quite far back, you're going to lose so much time in the early stints that I'm not really sure you can unleash some of the race pace that Mercedes believe that they have. We'll see that in a second. Sonoda though P5. So there was lots going on here, and as we see, Perez was only, okay, he was a fair few tenths off Max to be fair, but he's not miles away, but he's still behind and in the mix with a lot of other cars. I mean, we've got an AlphaTauri, an Alpine, a Williams ahead of Perez. So if any of that type of stuff continues tomorrow, it adds more fuel to the fire. Now, the Aston Martins weren't so good in this session, it seemed like, and the Ferraris didn't really do any soft practice or softer tyre runs at all in FP1. They did some in FP2. Sainz couldn't really find his groove after Schwartzman stepped in for him in the first practice session, and even Leclerc wasn't far, was nowhere either, really. So it creates a really interesting setup going into Sunday. Lots of work overnight for Ferrari to do. They were fastest in Sector 3, which is kind of like the big straight down to the line. It's kind of confusing why they were good in Sector 3, but yet the first two sectors they were really nowhere. And Verstappen's fastest lap, if he did put it all together in all the sectors, would still have been about a 10th up on Norris's McLaren, with Hamilton not too far behind either. So pretty tasty looking at these free practice numbers. Now, what people are probably more interested in is the long run pace. And this is for FP1, when Verstappen was on the hards, Perez on the softs, and Perez was barely going faster than Verstappen on these laps, which is a little bit concerning, I think, for Sergio Perez. And these were the numbers based on FP2 race pace analysis, with Verstappen on the softs this time averaging a 1:16.1, Perez averaging a 1:16.5 on the mediums, same as Russell. Hamilton was on a 1:16.3 on the mediums, which is relatively pretty damn competitive, and it seemed like Mercedes on the radio were actually really rather happy with their performance so far. Alonso, Stroll, Sainz, Leclerc, Norris, so pretty interesting. Now, those numbers vary slightly. If you look at it on this analysis, you'll see the numbers are a bit different. Hamilton more like 1:16.5 on here, and Russell even a little bit further behind. It depends how you calculate it, because you're looking at, there's certain outlier laps where you're held up in traffic, and it's like, well, do you count that, do you not? Not all of the laps are going to be clean, but we can see Verstappen has an advantage, right, on the rest of the field, and that's emphasized, as always, in all of the numbers. So it's still going to be Verstappen's race to lose, but I think especially for qualifying, it's looking rather tasty. And Perez it's quite clear that they're putting down the line at Red Bull and saying, look, Perez, perform or you're out. It doesn't matter what we're doing in the championship. If Ricciardo does better than you, relatively, you're going to be gone. And that's been a quite stark change compared to what Red Bull were saying a few weeks ago, when it seemed to be, yeah, Perez is coming back, no bother. It seems like my initial theory from a couple of months ago that Perez is going to be gone is gaining more traction. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.